The poetry of the Old English period is generally grouped in two main divisions, national and Christian. To the former are assigned those poems of which the subjects are drawn from English, or rather Teutonic, tradition and history, or from the customs and conditions of English life. To the latter, those which deal with biblical matter, ecclesiastical traditions, and religious subjects of definitely Christian origin. The line of demarcation is not, of course, absolutely fixed. Most of the national poems in their present form contain Christian elements, while English influence often makes itself felt in the presentation of biblical or ecclesiastical subjects. But on the whole, the division is a satisfactory one, in spite of the fact that there are a certain number of poems as to the classification of which some doubt may be entertained. We are concerned here only with the earlier national poems. With one or two possible exceptions, they are anonymous, and we have no means of assigning to them with certainty even an approximate date. There can be little doubt, however, that they all belong to times anterior to the unification of England under King Alfred, A.D. 886. The later national poetry does not begin until the reign of Ethelstan. With regard to the general characteristics of these poems, one or two preliminary remarks will not be out of place. First, there is some reason for believing that, for the most part, they are the work of minstrels rather than of literary men. In two cases, with Sith and Deor, we have definite statements to the effect, and from Bede's account of Cadmon, we may probably infer that the early Christian poems had a similar origin. Indeed, it is by no means clear that any of the poems were written down very early. Scarcely any of the manuscripts date from before the 10th century, and, though they are doubtless copies, they do not betray traces of very archaic orthography. Again, it is probable that the authors were, as a rule, attached to the courts of kings, or, at all events, to the retinues of persons in high position. For this statement, we also have no positive evidence except in the cases of Widsith and Deor, but it is favored by the tone of the poems. Some knowledge of music and recitation seems indeed to have prevailed among all classes. Just as in Beowulf, not only Hrothgar's bard, but even the king himself is said to have taken part among others in the recitation of stories of old time. So Bede, in the passage mentioned above, relates how the harp was passed round at a gathering of villagers, each one of whom was expected to produce a song. But the poems which survived, especially epic poems, are likely to have been the work of professional minstrels, and such persons would naturally be attracted to courts by the richer rewards, both in gold and land, which they received for their services. It is not only in Old English poems that professional minstrels are mentioned. From Cassiodorus, we learn that Clovis begged Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, to send him a skilled harpist. Again, Priscus, in the account of his visit to Attila, describes how at the evening feast 2 men, whom probably we may regard as professional minstrels, came forward and sang of the king's victories and martial deeds. Some of the warriors, he says, had their fighting spirit roused by the melody, while others, advanced in age, burst into tears, lamenting the loss of their strength. A passage which bears rather a striking resemblance to Beowulf's account of the feast of Hrothgar's hall. It is customary to classify the early national poems in 2 groups, epic and elegiac. The former, if we may judge from Beowulf, ran to very considerable length, while all the extant specimens of the latter are quite short. There are, however, 1 or 2 poems which can hardly be brought under either of these heads, and it is probably due to accident that most of the shorter poems which have come down to us are of an elegiac character. The history of our national epic poetry is rendered obscure by the fact that there is little elsewhere with which it may be compared. We need not doubt that it is descended ultimately from the songs in which the ancients were wont to celebrate deeds of famous men such as Arminius. But regarding the form of these songs, we are unfortunately without information. The early national epic poetry of Germany is represented only by a fragment of 67 lines, while the national poetry of the North, rich as it is, contains nothing which can properly be called epic. It cannot therefore be determined with certainty whether the epos was known to the English before the invasion, or whether it arose in this country, or again whether it was introduced from abroad in later times. Yet the fact is worth noting that all the poems of which we have any remains deal with stories relating to continental or Scandinavian lands. Indeed, in the whole of our early national poetry there is no reference to persons who are known to have lived in Britain. Kogel put forward the view that epic poetry originated among the Goths, and that its appearance to the northwest of Europe is to be traced to the harpist who was sent to Clovis by Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths. Yet the traditions preserved in our poems speak of professional minstrels before the time of Clovis. The explanation of the incident referred to may be merely that minstrelsy had attained greater perfection among the Goths than elsewhere. Unfortunately, Gothic poetry has wholly perished. Although definite evidence is wanting, it is commonly held that the old Teutonic poetry was entirely strophic, much in this case with all the extant Old Norse poems. Such is the case with all the extant Old Norse poems, and there is no reason for thinking that any other form of poetry was known in the north. Moreover, in two of the earliest Old English poems, with Sith and Deor, the strophes may be restored practically without alteration of the text. An attempt has even been made to reconstruct Beowulf in strophic form. But this can only be carried out by dealing with the text in a somewhat arbitrary manner. In Beowulf, as indeed in most Old English poems, new sentences and even new subjects begin very frequently in the middle of the verse. The effect of this is, of course, to produce a continuous metrical narrative, which is essentially foreign to the strophic type of poetry. Further, it is not to be overlooked that all the strophic poems which we possess are quite short. Even Atlamal, the longest narrative poem in the Edda, scarcely reaches 1/8 of the length of Beowulf. According to another theory, epics were derived from strophic lays, though never actually composed in strophic form themselves. This theory is, of course, by no means open to such serious objections. It may be noted that in some of the earliest Old Norse poems, e.g., Helgakvisa, Hundingsbana II, and Helgakvisa, Kjörvarosonar, the strophes contain only speeches, while the connecting narrative is given quite briefly in prose. Such pieces might very well serve as the basis of epic poems. The greater length of the latter may, then, be accounted for by the substitution of detailed descriptions for the short prose passages, by the introduction of episodes drawn from other sources, and perhaps also by the combination of two or more lays in one poem. In any such process, however, the original materials must have been largely transformed. By far the most important product of the national epos is Beowulf, a poem of 3,183 lines, which has been preserved practically complete in an MS of the 10th century, now in the British Museum. It will be convenient at the outset to give a brief summary of its contents. The poem opens with a short account of the victorious Danish king Skjold-Sefing, whose obsequies are described in some detail. His body was carried on board a ship piled up with arms and treasures. The ship passed out to sea, and none knew what became of it. The reigns of Sild's son and grandson, Beowulf, and Hilfdin are quickly passed over, and we are next brought to Hrothgar, the son of Hilfdin. He builds a splendid hall called Heorot, in which to entertain his numerous retinue. His happiness is, however, destroyed by Grendel, a monster sprung from Cain, who attacks the hall by night and devours as many as 13 knights at a time. No one can withstand him, and in spite of sacrificial offerings, the hall has to remain empty. When Grendel's ravages have lasted 12 years, Beowulf, a nephew of Hygelak, king of the Geatas, and a man of enormous strength, determines to go to Hrothgar's assistance. He embarks with 14 companions, and on reaching the Danish coast, is directed by the watchman to Hrothgar's abode. The king, on being informed of his arrival, relates how he had known and befriended Ecgtheow, Beowulf's father. Beowulf states the object of his coming, and the visitors are invited to feast. During the banquet, Beowulf is taunted by Unferth, the king's orator, with having failed in a swimming contest against a certain Breca. He replies, giving a different version of the story, according to which he was successful. Then the queen, Wiltheo, fills Beowulf's cup, and he announces his determination to conquer or die. As night draws on, the king and his retinue leave the hall to the visitors. They go to sleep, and Beowulf puts off his armor, declaring that he will not use his sword. Grendel bursts into the hall and devours one of the knights. Chomp, 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 chomp. Beowulf, however, seizes him by the arm, which he tears off after a desperate struggle, and the monster takes to flight. Whee! Mortally wounded, Beowulf displays the arm, and the Danes come to express their admiration of his achievement. They tell stories of heroes of the past, of Sigmund and his nephew Fitela, and of the Danish prince Hermod. Then Hrothgar himself arrives, congratulates Beowulf on his victory, and rewards him with rich gifts. During the feast which follows, the king's minstrel recites the story of Hnef and Finn, to which we shall have to return later. The queen comes forward, and after addressing Hrothgar, together with his nephew and colleague Hrothwulf, thanks Beowulf and presents him with a valuable necklace. This necklace, it is stated, was afterwards worn by Hygelak and fell into the hands of the Franks at his death. Hrothgar and Beowulf now retire, but a number of knights settle down to sleep in the hall. During the night, Grendel's mother appears and carries off Eschere, the king's chief counselor. Beowulf is summoned, and the king, overwhelmed with grief, tells him what has happened and describes the place where the monsters were believed to dwell. Beowulf promises to exact vengeance. They set out for the place, a pool overshadowed with trees, but apparently connected with the sea. Beowulf plunges into the water and reaches a cave, where he has a desperate encounter with the monster. Eventually he succeeds in killing her with a sword which he finds in the cave. He then comes upon the corpse of Grendel and cuts off its head. With this he returns to his companions, who had given him up for lost. The head is brought in triumph to the palace, and Beowulf describes his adventure. The king praises His exploit and contrasts his spirit with that of the unfortunate Prince Heremod. From this he passes to a moralizing discourse on the evils of pride. On the following day, Beowulf bids farewell to the king. They part affectionately, and the king rewards him with further gifts. Beowulf and his companions embark and return to their own land. The virtues of Hygd, the young wife of Hygelak, are praised, and she is contrasted with Thritol, the wife of Offa, who in her youth had displayed a murderous disposition. Beowulf greets Hygelak and gives him an account of his adventures. Part of his speech, however, is taken up with a subject which, except for a casual reference in chapter 2, 83, 85, has not been mentioned before. Except for a casual reference in 2, 83, 85 has not been mentioned before. Namely, the relations between Hrothgar and his son-in-law Ingeld, prince of the Heathobarden. Ingeld's father, Froda, had been slain by the Danes, and he was constantly incited by an old warrior to take vengeance on the son of the slayer. Then Beowulf hands over to Hygelak and Hygd the presents which Hrothgar and Wiltho had given him, and Hygelak in turn rewards him with a sword and with a large share in the kingdom. A long period is now supposed to elapse. Hygelak has fallen, and his son Heardred has been slain by the Swedes. Then Beowulf has succeeded to the throne and reigned gloriously for 50 years. In his old age, the land of the Getas is ravaged, and his own home destroyed by a fire-spitting dragon, which, after brooding for 300 years over the treasure of men long since dead, has had its lair robbed by a runaway slave. Beowulf, greatly angered, resolves to attack it. Now comes a digression referring to Beowulf's past exploits, in the course of which we learn that he had escaped by swimming when Hygelak lost his life in the land of the Frisians. On his return, Hygd offered him the throne, but he refused it in favor of the young Heardred. The latter, however, was soon slain by the Swedish king Ornella, because he had granted asylum to his nephews, Bunaned, Gils, the sons of Othere. Vengeance was obtained by Beowulf later, when he supported Edgils in a campaign which led to the king's death. Beowulf now approaches the dragon's lair. He reflects on the past history of his family. Herthin, king of the Getas, had accidentally killed his brother Herbald, and their father Hethrel died of grief in consequence. His death was followed by war with the Swedes, in which first Herthin and then the Swedish king Ongeto, Ornella's father, were slain. When Hygelak, the third brother, perished among the Frisians, Dagreven, a warrior of the Hugas, was crushed to death by the hero himself. Beowulf orders his men to wait outside while he enters the dragon's burrow alone. He is attacked by the dragon, and his sword will not bite. Wiglaf, one of his companions, now comes to the rescue, but the rest, in spite of his exhortations, flee into a wood. As the dragon darts forward, again Beowulf strikes it on the head, but his sword breaks, and the dragon seizes him by the neck. Wiglaf succeeds in wounding it, and Beowulf, thus getting a moment's respite, finishes it off Wiglaf succeeds in wounding it, and Beowulf, thus getting a moment's respite, finishes it off with his knife. But the hero is mortally wounded. Beowulf gives him directions with regard to his funeral, presents him with his armor and necklace, and then dies. The cowardly knights now return and are bitterly upbraided by Wiglaf. A messenger brings the news to the warriors who have been waiting behind. He goes on to prophesy that now their heroic king has fallen. The Getas must expect hostility on all sides. With the Franks, there has been no peace. Since Hygelak's unfortunate expedition against the Frisians and Hetware, while the Swedes cannot forget Ongen Theos disaster, which is now described at length.